everybody hear me? I'm not very good at standing still, so I'm going to use one of these. There we go. Okay. One of the great things about doing work with IMRG is, well, in fact, two great things about doing work with IMRG is, first of all, they have these fantastic sources of data available. There's kind of all sorts of indexes and tracking and all kind of things like that. And secondly, that it's a community of retailers. And they have the ability, almost at the drop of a hat, I discovered, to kind of survey their retailer members and obtain interesting insight from that. And I just wanted to share one or two highlights from that in the context of international e-commerce. First thing we were able to discover actually is that IMRG members, IMRG members typically at the moment are shipping to English-speaking countries but with slightly different English. They're shipping to countries with different currency. They're shipping to countries with different tax rates applying, with different legal systems, with different public holidays. Is that any better? Sorry. And in fact, those countries account already for somewhere between 6 and 7.5% of all traffic, according to the data that IMRG are being able to collect. And for those who kind of haven't worked it out already, the country in question, Scotland. So already you might want to think about your cross-border and international shipping strategy if what might happen tomorrow happens tomorrow. I also wanted to use that as an illustration of the joys of trusting the data. I have to say I've kind of selected some highlights from the data in order to make that point, which is a topic I want to come back to as I talk some more. So, looking slightly more, just introduce me briefly, sorry I've forgotten I got that slide in there. I'm a freelance consultant. I do a lot of work from IMRG. I'm not going to say very much about me. I do kind of big stuff. I was e-commerce director for Doc Martens recently, and I also do small stuff, including some fun things. Fifth Element is Belarus's biggest consumer electronics retailer. For those who haven't been to Belarus, interesting place. It's kind of a country that appears to have been designed by its IT department. It's full of fantastic features that nobody wants. It's kind of like a Russian Milton Keynes. Okay, I'll look at a few more data points from IMRG, just to come back to the international topic. The first thing to say is a lot of you are already doing a lot of international stuff. That kind of 18% growth that Andrew was talking about a minute ago, when it comes to international, really rather pathetic. Pretty much a third of IMRG members saw international sales growth of over 50% in the last 12 months. Most, when you look at the data, are seeing growth which is significantly faster than their shipping to the UK. In other words, it is a serious story, it is happening, and the results can be quite spectacular. Another very interesting data point that I also wanted to share, because it has a very strong bearing on what's going to be talked about for the rest of the day, is the difference and the difference it can make between simply kind of shipping to a foreign country and localizing. And although one needs to be a bit careful with the data, what IMRG's members are reporting is an average uplift compared to shipping internationally by putting in a localized site in a specific country or specific region of 91%, simply by localizing the experience for customers. I have to say that's very consistent with my personal experience working with clients as well. I was surprised how consistent it was when that data point emerged. But it kind of says very much why we're here. Well, that's the reason why. First of all, a huge amount of growth available, and secondly, if you take it a step further and try and localize even more available without phenomenal amount of effort. Question then is, so if I'm going to localize, where should I go? And the big challenge with that is that there are an awful lot of statistics. Staggering numbers of statistics, broadband penetration, penetration of e-commerce per head, it goes on and on and on. And only in some markets can those statistics be taken at face value. Just draw a contrast between UK, first of all, and, as it happens, Russia. So, if you look at the UK, e-commerce is pretty evenly spread. This data is basically taking the Metapack IMRG delivery index and looking how that matches against the population of the different regions of the UK. And you can see it's pretty homogeneous. Okay, Greater London, as you expect possibly a little more. Some of the less well-off regions, possibly a little less, but fundamentally, it's pretty evenly spread. In other words, if you want to do, if you were a non-UK company thinking, well, let's look at the UK, you can reasonably look at the UK, notwithstanding my Scotland joke at the beginning, as a whole. That isn't the case in a lot of other places. Russia is a nice example to look at. Russia isn't Russia for the purposes of e-commerce. Russia is Moscow and St. Petersburg and one or two other secondary cities, but primarily it's Moscow and St. Petersburg. Why does that matter? Because in Moscow and St. Petersburg, actually, you have a better opportunity than Belgium. Higher online spending per head, more than double the population. But you don't have 145 million Russians to go at if you are looking at doing Russia as a potential market. There is a smaller market, but a very good market. And of course, that has huge implications for the rest of your strategy. Suddenly, you're not asking, how on earth do we do logistics for the whole of Russia? You're saying, okay, how do we do logistics for potentially one or two densely populated areas? If you've ever been in Moscow's traffic, densely populated areas with even worse traffic than central London, but otherwise reasonably accessible, if you can get the goods in, markets. And I just wanted to use that as one example of needing to be very careful with statistics provided at a country level, or frankly statistics at all, when trying to choose your countries. Many countries, most countries in fact, when it comes to e-commerce are not the whole country. Western Europe is largely an exception. Governments tend to have policies of driving broadband access outside the big cities. It's by no means the case in many of the more attractive or interesting markets that you might be contemplating, including places, frankly, like Spain, which might be on people's list, where, again, the tools needed to make e-commerce work aren't necessarily there. The infrastructure needed to make e-commerce work isn't necessarily there. So, second question I just wanted to touch on is preferred route to market. The UK, people tend to think of e-commerce as primarily, you've got your own website. I suspect everybody in that room is going to be having their own website. And the primary route to market for most people, I suspect, in this room is a B2C website. That isn't the case in many other markets. China is probably the best known example. On the latest figures, I was able to obtain 72% of Chinese e-commerce C2C. The UK, it's rather difficult to get data because Amazon are a little bit coy about releasing the size of Amazon Marketplace. There is data for the US, and there's every reason to believe it's pretty similar. But a completely different picture. C2C preferred or B2C preferred. Essentially, marketplaces or own website. That clearly presents some challenges if you're used to running your own retail website, and then we're going to have to go onto a marketplace. There are a whole bunch of questions that need to be thought about. Or, more interestingly, you can potentially take a tip out of the locals book. However, it's worth noting the locals book is written back to front compared with what everybody expects in the UK. So, come back to that one. A brand that might not trip off everybody's kind of brand name recognition tongue, marked Fairwhale, say Chinese kind of mid-market fashion brand. They did a very interesting presentation recently at a conference in Beijing, and I kind of nicked their slide, to be honest, for the purpose of this. They have taken a view that they have to be on both the marketplace channels and the flash sale channels, like Secret Sale or Vente Privée, if you're familiar with that in France, and have a B2C store. But unlike fashion retailers in the UK, where the marketplace tends to be the kind of clearance channel for the end of the range, and getting rid of your overstocks and dealing with the unfortunate mistakes, their view is actually that the marketplace is the lead channel. And they go so far as to say, okay, in order to operate in China, we have to prepare a low-cost introductory range that we will use to lead at the beginning of the season, that we will use to draw customers in, and eventually, hopefully, push them across to our main brand site, our B2C experience, or our Tmall brand experience, where we can look to charge full price for our products at full margin. So almost completely opposite strategy to how you would tackle the same problem potentially in the UK, where you would be looking at seeing these as clearance. These they're seeing very much as bringing the customer to the market. Similar strategy actually talked about by Walt Disney. They are using the marketplaces, interestingly, to sell coupons. And the coupons then can be redeemed on their main site, which is a slightly interesting twist on the whole approach. But fundamentally, in these kind of marketplace-led countries, you have to be thinking in a different way. I particularly liked that one as an example of kind of multiple level thinking, and a place where one can learn from local best practice, and kind of see a blend between local best practice and all your own learnings. Just to illustrate the kind of challenges, shall we say, of potentially operating in that marketplace, I was able to get some data from a footwear brand. For those who know me, it's not Doc Martens, I used to work for, about their visitor traffic during peak seasons. There is their brand seasonality in Europe. You can see sort of peaking at Christmas. And if you can see it, there is their brand seasonality in China. Half of it is on one day. Slightly more than half of it in practice is on one day. For those who've ever done flowers on Valentine's Day here, actually that's not the peak day is Mother's Day, because it's women buying and not men, and men always forget. For those who've ever done a kind of Valentine's Day or a Mother's Day offer, you might sort of recognize this. Very difficult. In China, huge focus on this entirely artificially invented festival, Singles Day, a little gem from our friend Jack Ma from Alibaba. Enormously discount driven. If you don't have a discount offer on that day, you aren't going to sell anything. Half your sales are going to take place on that day if you decide to go for focusing on that day. And obviously, therefore, some interesting challenges with logistics, stock availability, all that kind of thing. I spoke to another footwear retailer, again, I won't name names, who were saying to me, we do not expect to be able to sell more than 10% of any of our sales, make more than 10% of any of our sales in China at full price. Everything else will have to be discounted, otherwise consumers aren't going to be interested. So, just another interesting example of the challenges involved in localization and also the importance of learning from local experience. One final example, just to kind of make the point even more, e-commerce is not the same in other countries. I'm assuming here I'm talking to a room full of e-commerce experts, and I'll just share with you one recent challenge I had. I have a client in the Ukraine, based in Kiev, and they asked me to take a look at their current website. They've just done a takeover, wanted to health check their current website, Of course, if you're a consultant, kind of looking at the checkout, it's usually pretty easy meat, to be honest. You kind of go in and go, well, your checkout's not very good, improve this, improve this, improve this. And it's usually a pretty soft target. I'll just share that exercise with you, and there's a bit of a quiz, see if you can suggest any recommendations. There is their checkout, all of it. And you'll see, for those of you that have spent time optimizing multi-step checkouts, or frankly, even those of you that have spent time optimizing single-page checkouts, it doesn't look very familiar. Okay, Google's made an interesting job of translating credit on the couch. So, I'm tempted to leave you to imaginations, but actually it means you place an order and then a representative from a bank comes out to your house and sorts out a loan agreement in order for you to then purchase the goods before the completion takes place. It is in fact their biggest channel. More importantly as well, the checkout is not e-commerce as you know it. Now these people do know what they're doing. They're one of the biggest retailers in the Ukraine. This isn't an amateur small operation. It's simply that business is done differently there. You order on the website. The website is actually a pretty good website. You can always improve a website, but it's pretty good. You come to the checkout, you give your mobile phone number, the town in which you live, and somebody calls you back 3 minutes later. And the whole delivery process, the whole payment process, and to be honest, most of the cross-selling and upselling takes place on the telephone. And that's not because they're rubbish and can't do the technology. It's because that's what consumers in that market expect. That is e-commerce in the Ukraine, or e-commerce in Kiev. In many ways, it's kind of better than here. You get that human contact, you get the opportunity to do the sales job, you get a much stronger opportunity to close the sale. Their checkout dropout rate is frankly pretty small compared to what people would be used to here. But of course you do have the cost of 2 or 3 phone calls because very rarely is it all settled in one go. Completely different business model. It's not a very big change. But if you're thinking, oh, I'll localize my website and I'll put my current checkout on it and that'll all be wonderful and go into this market, no. You'll get about 5% of the sales you should be doing. Very, very different picture, but it's still e-commerce. But what you know, and I'm sure an area where everybody spends ages fretting about optimizing, very, very different story. So, to kind of sum that all up, if you're going to localize, it is worth it. You can expect sales to increase enormously if you do proper localization and do it well. But translation is not localization. Even adding the payment methods gets you half the way there. You have to take into account local best practice and the local preferred style of e-commerce. And my personal opinion is you either have to have a local or you have to have an expert. Or you have to have some very good information supplied by IMRG. But it isn't simply a question of translation. Translation is not localization, but localization is a huge opportunity. Thanks very much.